I hope that you have had a good opportunity at some point this summer to get away, to refresh, to relax, be away with friends or maybe family a little bit, or maybe have that coming up. Our family has gotten an opportunity a couple times this summer, and back in June and a few weeks ago to get away for 1 week each time, and it was great. A couple of weeks ago we were in Invermere. Many of you guys know where that is, and we enjoyed a week there with our family, which we do every year. It's kind of a family tradition. We've been going there for over 20 years together with the extended family, and so we were over there in Invermere, and we had a great week together, just relaxing and doing things that we love together, floating, golfing, biking, doing all that stuff. And as we got to the close of the week, the smoke started coming in. Many of you guys are aware of the wildfires that have been going on. So the smoke started kind of coming in. The last weekend we were there, and there was wildfires near Kimberley. And the one night, the fires got so bad it took the electricity out in the whole Columbia Valley. So all the way from Cranbrook to Golden, there was no electricity. So Saturday night, everything just went dark. So we started, we were playing games by, I was going to say candlelight, but by iPhone light, right? So we put the iPhones up on the ceiling, and we were like huddled underneath the iPhones playing games together. I got up the next morning thinking that the power was going to be back on. It wasn't back on, and I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then it was time to pack up and go. And so we get in the truck, and my truck says that there's 80 kilometers left on my tank. And I'm like, I wonder if I can still get gas. So, I wasn't like, how dependent on electricity are we actually? So I head to the gas station. Like, no, every gas station is closed. Every restaurant is closed. There was like nothing running. And I had enough gas to get from Invermere to Radium. We were in Fairmont. From Fairmont to Invermere. So I was like, okay, well, let's just drive to Invermere. So we went to Invermere, and we stopped at the main gas station there at the main intersection. And there was like loads of people just like all on the highway. People are freaking out. And so I don't know how I'm going to get back to Alberta, get back to Banff. That's where the closest gas station was. I got 80 kilometers left on my tank. Quick Google Maps, it's like 150 kilometers I got to go to get to the next gas station. And so I just find a pump and I park there. I'm like, I'm just going to park here until the gas comes back on. And everybody else was doing the same thing. We just had like lineups of vehicles just parked all over the highway, lining up behind gas stations, just waiting. We had there was a camper trailer behind us. They set up camp, literally set up camp right in the middle of the gas station, the motorhome, the kids are running around. It was like everybody's camping in front of the gas station. And then people start freaking out because they don't know when the power's going on. All the restaurants are closed, and things that had to be, refrigerated, aren't going to last very long. And so the gas station kind of opened its doors, but the lights aren't on, the cash registers don't work. And so people are going into the dark of the grocery store with their iPhones, looking around, pulling out the essentials, the ice, milk, beer. So they're all walking out with essentials because they don't know how long this is going to last for. And so we sit there just for a couple hours. I'm like, I don't know how long it's. And then I hear somebody say, this could last for a couple of days. I'm like, I cannot sit here for a couple of days. And so I phoned my father-in-law, who lives in Northwest Calgary. I said, this is the situation. Do you have plans today? Any chance you'd want to drive me some gasoline? And, desperate times call for desperate measures. So I phone him, and he gets a bunch of jerry cans, fills 4 jerry cans, drives them all the way out to me, and fills up my gas tank so I can get home. Come on, that's a great father-in-law right there. So when you're a preacher and you're thinking about these things, you're always thinking of, is this an allegory, or is this an analogy for faith in some way? And it is, because at the end of the day, faith begins always where self-sufficiency ends. And we are always self-sufficient. We think we can do things on our own until we can't. And we realize that we're not as self-sufficient as we think. And so we make a call, we reach out, we get desperate, we change our routine. And for me, that meant I had to reach out to my father-in-law because I had no other options. And when we think about faith in God, many of us go through life on our own sufficiency, on our own capabilities, on our own resources, until we get to the point where we realize we cannot do this on our own ourselves. And so we change, we pray, we cry out. And we've been looking at this series called The Hall of Faith, looking at people who at some point in their lives reached out to God, trusted in God, and then God did something through them. God provided them with resources to be able to do something that they weren't able to do on their own. But here's the lie that many of us believe, that we are self-sufficient. And the good news of the Bible can sometimes sound like bad news. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. And no matter how self-sufficient you think you are, how much you think you can manage life on your own, the truth is that you can't. Even when we think we can. The way home is a lot further than we think it is. And every single one of us needs to make that call, needs to make that decision to place our trust in a God who has infinite resources and knows our needs even more than we do. And so as we've been journeying through the Hall of Faith, we recognize that as we looked at these characters, many of them out of Hebrews 11, which is a chapter in the New Testament, which kind of describes all of these people in God's story who were people of faith that took great steps of faith, and God met them in their deepest needs. And we've been encouraged by these people because we've realized very quickly that they're not perfect. And that's an encouragement to me. I don't know about you, but when you see people that fail, there's a sick part of you that's like, okay, that encourages me. Because I'm not the only one. And so as we go through these characters, we realize they're not perfect people, which is encouraging because we are not either. And today we're looking at the story of Gideon. And very quickly, you're going to see that Gideon is very human. He's very human. And I think there's two Gideons we're going to encounter. There's an early Gideon, there's a later Gideon, and both Gideons are very relatable for two different reasons. Both Gideons have very significant struggles and hurdles they got to overcome. And I think no matter who you are, what your story is, you're going to be able to relate to one of those two Gideons. So in Hebrews 11, back to the Hall of Faith chapter, it says, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David and Samuel and the prophets." Well, lucky for you, we do have time. The author of Hebrews didn't, but we do. And so we're going to take a little bit of time to look at that first character, Gideon. And so there's 3 chapters in the book of Judges where the story of Gideon comes through. And this would have been the story that the writers of Hebrews was thinking of, particularly the first 2 chapters, particularly the middle chapter. But I want to consider Gideon's life in 3 different chapters and 3 different acts. And the acts almost line up with each of the chapters. So Judges 6, 7, and 8 is where the story of Gideon comes from. So let's look at Act 1 as we begin. So Act 1, the Israelites are being oppressed. They're being oppressed by the Midianites. And we see at the beginning of Judges 6, it explains kind of the situation. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years, he gave them into the hands of the Midianites because the power of Midian was so oppressive. The Israelites prepared shelter for themselves in the mountain clefts, caves and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. And I don't know if you can relate to that. Every time you tried to do something and move forward, there was always something that knocked you back. And for 7 years, this was their story. This was Gideon's story. This was the story of the Israelites. No matter what they tried to plant, no matter what they tried to do, no matter what how they tried to move forward, they just couldn't get anywhere. And it's discouraging when you want your life to change, and no matter what you do, nothing can change. And so they had enemies that were proactively working against them, uprooting and destroying anything they were trying to build and do themselves. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. So they got to the end of their own resources. After these 7 years, they realized, hey, we can't do this on our own. This isn't working. God, will you help us? They made the call. And God listened to their cry. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in, that place that belonged to Joash, the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press to keep it from the Midianites. And so this, we just read over that, but this is significant. And so Midian is in a wine press. He's threshing wheat. And if you're not, I don't know how many we got any wheat threshers in the house this morning. Not very many. Okay, so it's not really something we do a lot, but when you thresh wheat, you have the chaff and the wheat, and so they would beat the chaff and the wheat, and they would separate the grain from the stalk, and they would throw it into the air, and the wind would blow the chaff away because it was lighter, and then the grain of wheat would fall. And so they would do this in the open air, and that's how they separated and got the wheat. And so Midian is hiding in a wine press, which has walls. So he had to get down into like this pit type of device. And so he's inside the pit, and he's trying to thresh wheat in the wine press, and he can't because there's no space, there's nowhere for anything to blow, and there's no wind that is getting in there. And so it seems ridiculous. And so why is he in there? Well, he's in there because when he's out in the open air, the Midianites can see him. Over 7 years, he's realized no matter what work they do, if they're seen, then it gets stolen, it gets destroyed. And so he's hiding. He's hiding because he's afraid. He's hiding because he's just tired of the same story happening over and over again. And so he's doing something in an environment that isn't really conducive to that environment, but it's the best that he has. And so we see pretty quickly this characteristic of Gideon, that he's a little bit afraid. He likes to hide. And so he's kind of got the sheepish personality. He's hiding, he's afraid, and he's tired of doing the same thing and having the Midianites destroy the efforts that he's putting in. And then the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And this sounds a little bit like sarcasm because he's hiding. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. And in fact, it's in quotations, and we could say, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. I can remember when my kids were way younger than they are now, and our youngest son, Silas, was about 5 years old, and you'd say things in quotations, which was, you'd say things sarcastically, and if that means the opposite of what you're trying to say, right? And so Silas would observe this characteristic where people would say things in quotations. He's like, "What, Dad, why do we do that?" It's like, well, we're meaning the opposite thing that we're saying when we say blah, blah, blah. That means the opposite when you do this. And so he says, "Oh, like Joel's really good at math." So you're a bright 5-year-old. You kind of get it. But there is a sense of sarcasm here. But there's also more than that going on. God sees something in Gideon that he doesn't see in himself. And that is true of all of us, that God sees who you can become before you do. God sees who you can become before you do. No matter what you think about yourself, God created you with something in mind, with a person in mind, with a calling in mind. And so it's not sarcastic, it's also prophetic. You're a mighty warrior. That's who I created you to be. So then Gideon asked 2 questions, and I think the 2 questions that Gideon asks is 2 questions that every single one of us asks at least at one point in our lives, probably multiple times in our lives. And so the first question he says, and he addresses God very politely, "Pardon me, my Lord." Like he's very sheepish. You kind of get this type of posture from Gideon, like, "Pardon me, God. But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us?" Now, isn't that the human question? If God is who he said he is, then why is this happening to us? Why is this happening to me? Why the pain? Why the struggle? Why the diagnosis? If the Lord is with us, why this anxiety? Why this depression? Why can't I kick this addiction? Why does everything feel like it's falling apart? Why can't I find work? Why do I find myself back at the same spot that I was? If God is who he says he is and God is with us, then why am I here? Some of you are asking that question right now. Some of you have asked that question. And this question inevitably leads, I think, to a second question. And Gideon asked the second question. Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about? When they said, "Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." And so the second question he asks is like, I've heard stories. I've heard stories about this God. I've heard people talk about it, and I've been to church. I've heard sermons. I've talked to friends. I've heard testimonies, and it seems like everybody has a story about God except for me. And so question 1, why am I here? Question 2, why is it that God seems to show up for other people and not for me? Why does it seem like the life I read about in the Bible isn't the life that I'm experiencing now? Man, these are human questions, aren't they? And so how does God answer this question? Pretty simply, pretty quickly. The Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength that you have and save Israel out of Midian's hands. Am I not sending you? So God essentially says, Gideon, I do have an answer to your question, and I've actually called you to be a part of the answer. And so very sheepishly, Gideon responds again, pardon me, my Lord. But, we all have a but, don't we? Hello, how can I? Like, my clan is the weakest. So now his list of excuses. My clan is the weakest in Manasseh. I am the least in my family. Do you have any idea who I am? I think you're talking to the wrong person. I don't know if you've ever had that feeling where you feel like God is asking you to do something. You're like, God, do you know who you're talking to? Like this is me. Let me tell you who I am, as if God doesn't know who you are. Let me tell you who I am. God says, I see you. Gideon says, I don't think you really see me. Let me tell you who I am. I'm the weakest. I'm the least in my family. My clan is the weakest in my entire tribe. And then it's fascinating how the Lord answers. Because the Lord doesn't answer by telling Gideon that he's wrong. He just simply says, I will be with you. And there's a couple of times where the Lord says to Gideon and encourages him, I will be with you. And so we could think of it a little bit like selfies and photography. I don't know if you remember when selfies became a thing. Before like the iPhone, you had cameras, like big cameras, and they were one directional, right? And so they were intended to point out. The entire design of the camera, like the whole front of it pointed out, and you would stand behind it. The screen would be behind it. And the intent of the camera was to capture a picture of something out there, right? And then the iPhone started coming, social media started coming, and I remember when it started happening, people started taking pictures of themselves. And this seems really weird it doesn't seem weird to us now, but it seemed very, very weird to me in the beginning. I was like, for all of photography history, like you didn't see people taking big cameras and like turning them around and taking pictures of themselves. But all of a sudden, it started to become a thing where people started taking selfies, pictures of themselves. I'm like, that's a really weird thing. And I remember feeling really uncomfortable with this idea. Like it's very narcissistic that we would just like take pictures of ourselves all the time. And then it became normal. Then it became something that everybody does. And then not only that, as the iPhones developed, there became like selfie pictures, right? Like you have a setting right on your phone. There's a picture on the front and there's a picture on the back. And so you can choose to take a selfie or you can take a picture of something out there. And I know that I'm getting old, and it's not just my knees that are telling me that. It's that I try to take a picture of something, and half the time I think I'm taking a picture of something out there, I'm actually taking a picture of myself. And so the amount of times where I'm like, hey, kids, get together, let me take a picture of you. And then I realize, oh, that's me. And I don't know if any of you guys have this, but I think I'm getting old because I'm taking selfies when I'm not trying to take selfies. But this is Gideon. Gideon is in selfie mode. The Lord is trying to do something. The Lord's talking to him, and Gideon is holding up his phone. He's looking at himself, and he's saying, Lord, look at me. Do you know who I am? Look at my life. Look at my story. I am the weakest. And God's simple response is, you're looking in the wrong direction. He doesn't say, no, your assessment of yourself isn't accurate. That's not actually his response. His response is, look at me. I am with you. I am the Lord your God. Stop looking at yourself. Look the other direction. And we, like those early cameras, we were created to look in a certain direction. I'm sorry if this discourages you, but you were not made to glare at yourself. In fact, one of the reasons why Gideon struggled with faith is because he was looking at himself. And the story begins to change when Gideon starts to look forward, when he starts to look at God. And so Gideon, again, being sheepish, being really doubtful, says, God, show me a sign. And then you go through the story, Gideon puts together a sacrifice. God miraculously sets the sacrifice on fire, displaying his power, trying to show Gideon that he is trustworthy, that he is the Lord. And then later that night, the Lord said to him, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one that's 7 years old, tear down your father's altar, Baal, and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. So before God is going to deal with the enemy out there, he has to deal with the enemy in here. Before God's going to deal with the evil that is the Midianites, he's going to deal with the evil that are the idols in Gideon's own family. And this seems to be the way that God always invites us to work, that he wants to deal with the heart before he deals with what is happening on the outside. And so he tells Gideon, tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. So these are two idols from the land that they were living in. Baal, representing storms and weather, and because of that, he became connected to fertility, food, well-being. Asherah was the god of fertility, the god of sexuality, the god of family and multiplication. And you could see that the people of the land were looking to Baal and Asherah, and we think, this is weird. You just start worshiping idols. No, they are human just like you and I. We tend to look to the things that will supply belonging and security and comfort and food and protect our families. They are just like you and me. And they are believing the cultural narrative that, Baal and Asherah are the best way for you to take care of you and take care of your family and take care of your future. And so his father had set up idols to Baal, Asherah poles. And so we may not set up these idols, but you and I look to all sorts of things for those same results. And so he says to Gideon, tear down those things. So Gideon was obedient partially. He took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it all at night. So the guy who threshes wheat in the winepress, he's now doing this at night. So we see this characteristic just coming through in Gideon, the first Gideon that we see in chapter 6. So he's doing it at night rather than in the daytime because he's afraid. And so long story short, the people find out that it was him and they were angry, but they end up sparing him. And then God is calling him to step out in faith. And then he says, God, I'm not sure I can trust you. Show me a sign. And so he puts a fleece on the ground and he says, if I wake up in the morning and the fleece is wet and the ground is dry, then I know I can trust you. And so God does that. And then he says, okay, pardon me, Lord. I think he just didn't want God to be right. He says, I'm going to put a fleece out on the ground, and then when I wake up the next day, I want the ground to be wet and the fleece to be dry. And then God does the same thing. And so God is taking away every excuse that Gideon has. And so we get to the second part of the story, and this is the exciting part of the story. This is the part of the story I'm sure the writers of Hebrews was reflecting back on when he said, remember Gideon. This is the part that everyone, if you know the story of Gideon, this is the part that you remember. And so the Midianites, they had a huge army. They had an army of about 135,000 men. And so in the second act of the story, it says that early in the morning, Gideon and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. So I'm going to get back to the too many men piece in a second, but we need the last part of that verse 2 is really, really important. The Lord is about to do something. Why? Because he wants to make sure that on the back end of this story, people don't think that it was them and their own resources and their own strength that did what only God could do. He said, I'm going to create a situation in which you are so dependent on me that you can't look back and say, we did it on our own strength. And so because of that reason, you have too many men. And Gideon's like, oh, wait a second. What do you mean by too many men? I have 32,000 men, which seems like a lot, but compared to 135,000 men, this is not very many people. Okay? We are a small percentage of their 135,000, and that seems like not a lot to me already. And God says, that's too many. And so I want you to give your army a choice. You're going to tell them, if you're afraid, you can go back home. It's okay. No pride here. Like if you're scared, just go back home. And Gideon's like, can I go back home? And so 22,000 men walk away, of which Gideon wishes he was probably one of them. And so he's left with 10,000. And we got 10,000 versus 135,000. And then God says, you still have too many men. He's like, what? What are you talking about? 10,000 is not very many. But God says, I want you to send them down to the water, get them to take a drink of water. And some of them are going to lean over, get right in the water, and they're going to drink straight from the water. And some of them are going to cup the water and bring it up to their mouths and lap it like dogs. And God says, I'm looking for the dogs. I'm choosing those men to be a part of the army. Okay, so this happens, and it turns out that out of the 10,000 men, 9,700 of them get down to the water, and only 300 of them bring the water to their mouths, and Gideon is left with 300 against an army of 135,000. So, I mean, God knows Gideon pretty well, and he knows that Gideon's going to need some encouragement, and he says, so if you're afraid, which the answer is yes, I am afraid, 300 versus 135,000. If you're afraid, he said, go down to the enemy camp at night. I'm going to show you something that's going to encourage you. So he goes down to at night to the enemy's camp, and he hears them over talking, and one guy wakes up and he has a dream. And long story short, the theme of the dream is he had a dream that the Israelites, led by this man named Gideon, comes and kills the Midianites with a sword. And they're all afraid. And so out of that, Gideon gains some confidence. He's like, okay, I think God is trustworthy. And so he starts rallying his 300 men, getting them ready for battle, giving them their weapons and his weapons of choice. I'm going to give you a trumpet, a pot, and a torch, each one of you. How inspiring is that? Here's your trumpet. Okay, me against 135,000. I got a trumpet, I got a pot, and then they put a torch inside the pot. I mean, I, for one, am just impressed that they could handle all of those things with two hands, okay? So each one of those men has a trumpet, a sword, and a pot. And he said, now we're going to go into the land of our enemies. And as we're going in, he divides them into 3 groups of 100. We're coming in from different sides. As we're going in, we're all going to yell, for the Lord and for Gideon. Something starts to switch in the story here. A little subtlety. But he says, you scream as you go into the enemy camp for the Lord, for Yahweh, and for Gideon. So they do. They run in, they smash the pots. For the Lord, for Gideon, the Midianites. It's the middle of the night. They're all confused. They think they're being invaded. They already had this fear that they were going to be invaded. And then they start running around, pulling out their swords, and they start attacking and killing each other. So with just trumpets, a pot, not that kind of pot, pots, and torches. They come into the enemy territory, and then God does something that only God can do, and the Midianites defeat themselves, and there's a few left, and they end up fleeing and running away. You guys with me? Okay, so this would have been the part of the story that everybody in Hebrews 11, when it was referring to, we think of, this is why Gideon was a great man of faith, but it's not the whole story. Sadly, it's not the whole story. We get to Acts chapter 3, and this is where things start to change significantly. At the end of chapter 7, it says that they called on the rest of the Israelites from Manasseh. So he calls the rest of his tribe. He says, come and join me. Let's chase the Midianites. Oh, wait a second. I thought God called you just to go with the 300 that you had. But something is motivating him now. He's like, call the rest of our tribe, get the rest of Manasseh. So they get the rest of Manasseh joins him. And then he calls to other Israelite tribes. They call on Naphtali, they call on Asher, they call on Ephraim. So he calls on 4 tribes in total to join the hunt as they chase down the Midianites. And who knows how many people they have that have joined him now. And so what happened to the 300 and what happened to Gideon? And as you follow the story, it seems like Gideon is infatuated with these 2 names that just keep coming up, Zebah and Zalmunna. And he talks about these guys. So they're chasing the Midianites. They get to one town, and they're trying to chase down these guys, and they're looking for help for him and his soldiers from the people of that town and looking for food, and they say, we're not going to help you. And then Gideon starts threatening them, and he seems very agitated, and he says, there's going to be consequences because he didn't help us. And they go to the next town, and the same thing happened, same conversation. They weren't willing to help him. And he said, we're trying to track down these guys. What is it with these guys? And if you don't help us, he threatens them too. Something bad is going to happen. And then later on, he comes back, and he kills the men of that town because they didn't help him in this moment. And so finally, Gideon chases down Zebah and Zalmunna. And then he asks them, what kind of men did you kill at Tabor? Men like you, they answered, each one with the bearing of a prince. Gideon replied to them, those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you. And then Gideon kills them. At the beginning of Gideon's story, he is motivated by faith. As the story continues, by the time we get to the third act of Gideon's story, he's motivated by revenge. By this false sense of justice. Something has changed in Gideon's heart. And the Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon told them, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. And so that sounds like the right thing to say, but it's actually just lip service. Right from here, he says, I do have one request, though, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder. It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. And so they gave Gideon their earrings of gold, over 40 pounds of gold. And then Gideon takes those 40 pounds of gold, and it says that he turned it into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. And an ephod is a metal garment that they would put on idols. And so he makes one not just out of metal, but of gold. And then it says, all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping that idol there. And it became a snare to Gideon and his family. As Gideon experienced success, as God fulfilled his promises and blessings, something switched for Gideon. And sometimes it takes more faith to handle the victory than it does to fight the battle. And Gideon made a decision that just didn't hurt him. This is the saddest part about the story. He didn't make a decision that just hurt him. He made a decision that hurt his own family, his own kids, and the whole nation of Israel. Gideon would end up having multiple wives. Gideon would have over 70 children. One of those children he would name Abimelech. And Abimelech means your father is king. I mean, I missed out on that opportunity with any of my kids, but which is an interesting thing to name your kids when you said you didn't have any desire to be king. The scared, insecure, and humble Gideon became vengeful, greedy, power-hungry, self-absorbed, and finished his life worshiping an idol rather than the God who called his name. 3 acts of Gideon. The first act is one of self-doubt, one of fear, timidity, one of honest humility. The second act, we see this posture of faith where he starts to believe and trust that God is who he said he was and that God can do more than he thought that God could do. And God begins to use him in powerful ways and miraculous ways. And then the third act of Gideon is the act of self-reliance. And what I would like you to see this morning is that Gideon struggled in 2 ways. 2 ways that I think are common to humans, common to you and common to me, and they both have to do with the selfie. The first selfie that Gideon takes that he's infatuated with is the guy when he's looking in the mirror. He doesn't like what he sees. He doesn't believe in himself. He's disappointed. He's doubtful. He's afraid. He's timid. But God says, you're looking in the wrong direction. Look at me. And so he does for a season. But then Gideon starts to take another selfie in the third act. Gideon, number 2, is infatuated with the selfie that is about his own power, his own success, how great he is, what he's accumulated, his own quest for vengeance. He's driven by something other than worshiping and obeying God. The life of faith begins when we stop focusing on ourselves and we start focusing on the God who calls our name. Which Gideon do you resonate with this morning? Gideon 1 from Act 1 or Gideon 3? And here's my guess, because you're human, that you will have a tendency to relate with one of those two. Perhaps you're here this morning and you're doubtful and you're filled with fear and doubts and disappointment. Maybe you're insecure. Maybe you have questions. God, where are you? God, why doesn't anything ever good happen to me? God, why am I stuck? God, I don't know if I can trust you. I'm not sure I believe your word. I'm not sure I believe the testimonies and the stories that I've heard from people around me of who you are. And maybe you can relate to that Gideon this morning, and God invites you to move from self-focus to God-focus. But perhaps there's some of you this morning, and I think sometimes it's easier to relate with Gideon 1 because there's a false sense of humility in that. But Gideon 2, the second version of Gideon, is harder, but probably just as common. That you've gone through life, that you've had success, that you've gained some level of wealth, some level of comfort. You've gained some wounds along the way. Maybe there's unforgiveness and bitterness that's growing in your heart. You've become self-reliant. But the truth is that selfie is just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than the first selfie. The truth is that both Gideon 1 and Gideon 2 were just as dependent on God. Both are dangerous because they're both infatuated with self. Both have less gas in their gas tank than it takes to get home. Before we close, I'm going to invite you to stand with me. The Apostle Paul says something in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. He says, speaking of Jesus, though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. Though he was rich, for your sake became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich. And so what does that mean for those who are poor? For those who relate to Gideon 1? Well, it means that Jesus is the ultimate source of hope. Jesus is the ultimate source of confidence. Turning your eyes away from yourself and looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of your faith, should be an encouragement for anyone who feels poor in any sense of the word. What does that verse mean for those who are rich? Well, here's the irony, is that none of us are as rich as we think we are. And that's the deception, and that's the delusion that Gideon believed. Gideon 2 was just as dependent and needy for God to show up in his life as Gideon 1. He just couldn't see it because he believed his own self-hype. So I invite you to close your eyes for a minute. And I want you to reflect for a minute and say, just ask the Lord the question, am I more in danger of being like Gideon 1 or Gideon 2? Which selfie am I most tempted to take? And I believe, because we're human, and these are stories about us, that one of those two selfies is a temptation for each person in this room. And so with your eyes closed, I just want you to reflect on that for a question, just for a second, and this is between you and the Lord. I just want you to put up a number, 1 or 2. And we're not looking at each other, this is between you and the Lord, but 1 or 2, this is the Gideon that I'm most tempted to be like, the selfie I'm most tempted to take, number 1 or 2. Just put that number in the air. 1 or 2. And no matter what number you put up, the invitation is the same for all of us. To look to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. So Lord, for those who put up 1, Lord, for those who come in the space this morning, struggling with doubt, hurt, disappointment, they feel stuck, they're afraid, they don't know whether they can trust you. Lord, you responded to Gideon by saying, go in the strength that you have, and I'm with you. Lord, may you encourage them to keep moving forward in the strength you have, and would you reveal your presence to them in Jesus' name. Lord, for those who put up number 2, Lord, for those who are tempted to move forward with self-reliance, their own comfort, their own wealth, their own accomplishments. For those of us, Lord, who are tempted to believe that we can make do on our own, Lord, may you save us from that self-deception. Lord, may you save us from making the mistakes that Gideon said, who built his legacy in his life, but he gave it up in a moment. Lord, may you save us from worshiping idols instead of turning to you. Lord Jesus, we thank you that Gideon is still in Hebrews 11, that he's still held up as an example of faith, even in his imperfection, Lord, and I thank you that you work in us and through us despite of our imperfections. We thank you for your richness, your riches that you poured out for us who are poor. Lord, thank you that you give us what we need to do what you've called us to do. We pray this, Jesus, in your name. And all God's people said,